All right, well, welcome back to Technically Challenged. This series that we are in is called Essential JavaScript. What is the bare essential JavaScript you need to learn to hit the ground running? So we're diving into the topic of functions today, so let's get started. As we talk about functions, we want to talk about what is a function, the anatomy of a function, and some of the features of a function. So what is a function? Well, simply put, a function is a piece of code that you can define and you can run over and over and over again. It is a set of commands or statements of code that you can run repeatedly and call it. And so this, for example here, we could call say hello, call say hello, call say hello. Once we define it once, which is also called a function declaration, we can call it multiple times. This is a very powerful feature. And let's see how it works. So in say hello, we have this keyword here, which is function, so we need to use that first. This is the name of the function. This here is the place where we would define any parameters. So if there was a parameter 1, parameter 2, for example, there can be more and more parameters. That's where we would define those, and then inside of these curly braces here is where the logic of the function occurs. So in our case, we could do something like console.log hello, and if we were to run this, we see hello. So when we call say hello, multiple times, it calls our code multiple times. Now this is really a helpful feature. It's also nice is you can call a function and you don't really necessarily know how it works underneath the hood. So in our example here, console.log is actually a function. We're calling a function here. Log is actually the function or method in this case. And we're calling it, and we don't necessarily know what it's doing under the hood. All we know is it's outputting to our console here, the text, hello. So functions are reusable blocks of code, reusable statements of code that we can define and use elsewhere. Also, we've learned there's a keyword to define it, and we can give it a name, and we can give it parameters, and we can have code inside. Another thing to know is that functions almost always return something. And so if I were to console.log the function isn't actually returning anything. So I can actually remove this. And if I run this, we're going to see undefined. And that's because it's returning undefined by default. But if I wanted to return hello instead, so now I'm not logging hello, I'm just returning hello. I forgot the return statement. So we need to use the return keyword here. If we return the string hello, it actually returns hello, which I am then logging what I've just returned. So it'll return something. The only case where it wouldn't return something is if we were to throw an error. So for example, if I throw an error, throw new error, bummer, and we'll look more at errors later. You'll see my editor kind of highlights this and says it's unreachable. That's because the execution of this function or this function stops running at this point in the code and throws an error or raises an error or exception into the compiler, and it doesn't execute any code or run any code below when the error occurs. So if I run this, you'll see we get an error message, new error, bummer. It doesn't actually print hello. So functions almost always return something, and by default they return undefined. So we can also do, instead of just say hello, we can change our function to say something, and we can actually pass in an argument. So thing to say, when you define a function inside of the braces, the thing that you pass in here is created as a variable. So thing to say is something that we can log now. And I'm going to return our return. I'm going to get rid of our return because we don't need it. And say something. Whoops. Say something. Well, now. Oh, I didn't pass anything to say. So it just is saying undefined. So we actually, when we call it, and without logging it actually, so this will probably be a little more clear. When we call it, hello, we can say whatever we want in there as a string. It'll now say hello, or it'll say goodbye. It'll say whatever we want it to say. So this is a very powerful feature. When we pass in something here, this is called an argument. We're passing an argument to this function. We're passing it in, or we are, supplying or giving an argument to this function. And when it's inside of this, it's called a parameter. It doesn't really matter. I usually mix them up half the time. And like I said, we can do multiple things. So instead of say something, we can say two things. And then this can be thing one and thing two. We can just define these however we want. It doesn't matter what we name them. They're basically just variables inside of this function scope, if you remember what we talked about last week. So in here we can say hello. And the second thing we can say is world. And if I run this, you'll see two different lines. Oh, I'm getting an error because I renamed the function. Say something is not defined. Say something isn't defined, and that's because I renamed it. Say two things. So I'm going to save that. Now you'll see hello and then world on two different lines because we have two console.log statements here. So we can define a function. We can give it a name, whatever name we want. We can pass in optional arguments here. And we can do code in here that we necessarily might not even know what's going on here. We can still call functions even if we don't know how they work. If I were to leave out one of these arguments, JavaScript doesn't enforce it. It'll just give us undefined for the second value, just like we would do if we were defining a variable with let. Let person1. If I were to log person1, which this is a little bit of review, we know that this will give us undefined. This is a default value for a let variable. Or maybe I didn't talk about this in variables. I don't remember. Anyways, the other thing to note is, and to remember, is that functions always return undefined by default, and they don't return if an error is thrown in the middle of the code. That's a quick overview of functions in JavaScript, some of their features, and we will do a follow-up video because there's more to functions than just this, but I didn't want to go too much in detail in the first video. And so I hope you enjoy this. Like, subscribe, or comment if you are benefiting from this content, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.